welcome to the Huddle Breakdown with me, Laura Bradburn. I am joined as always by Alan and James. Alan, I'll come to you first. How is this lovely weather in the UK treating you?
Yeah, very good. If I wasn't in all day on spreadsheets, but yeah, no, I'm just being silly. It's lovely. Yes, a bit warm for me if I'm honest, but I won't complain.
It must be getting a bit hot and bothered with all that spreadsheet shagging in this weather. But we'll leave you to that. And James, is it still absolutely roasting over where you are?
No, we've had a decided downturn towards cooler and wet, so it's raining all this week. So viewers will be content, though, to hear that I got all my yard work done for the week done ahead of time before the rain hits. So that's why I have this pinkish hue.
Yeah, don't worry, everybody. James got his yard work done. I know you've all been worrying about that for a week or so.
Exactly. Very stressful.
Yeah. But that's what you get for being smug about the weather last week, because you were quite smug.
That's how these things work. That's right.
Yes. So first thing we'll discuss is obviously the 3-1 victory over Hibs at Celtic Park at the weekend. Alan, I'll come to you first. I was doing a little bit of prep work, which I don't normally do, but I did decide to do a little bit of pre-show prep work, and I was looking back at the results that we've had against Hibs over the season. We've knocked them out of the 2 cup competitions and then also lost to them in the league. So coming into this one, I was expecting it to be a little bit more competitive than it ended up being. What was your thoughts on the game overall?
Yeah, we've had 2 cup ties at home. One very early in the season, and then the Scottish Cup match was actually quite an overwhelming win, even though it was like 2-0 on the scoreboard. But I thought this was a pretty enjoyable game. It was the second game this season in the league that Celtic have come from behind to win, but it was kind of safe in a way. There was lots of passing, but it was all done fairly purposefully, fairly speedy on the ball. Celtic, I thought the movement was good. There was always a spare player available. It wasn't like we were overwhelming them with chances and shots and all this sort of thing, but we certainly on a warm day overwhelmed them with possession. They were very passive without the ball. I think it's one of the highest or lowest from their perspective, highest passes per defensive action that Celtic have racked up this season is like nearly 20 by the way I calculate it. Most vendors will have it as a higher number than I do. I think I include more defense because I don't. Well, there is a reason for it. I don't have the time or effort, frankly, to differentiate between defensive actions in which half of the field they occur, whereas most vendors only count defensive actions in one half of the field. So that's why my numbers are always lower, but it's a decent proxy. Anyway, by that measure, basically not much pressing from Hibs in that sense. They were incredibly well organised in their shape, and it's incredible how you can be relatively successful in this league by simply being pretty well organised. And they are. They're very well organised as a team. And when I say well organised, I mean the team shape, the discipline around the shape, the roles that players are being asked to do, because they haven't got. I don't want to be. I don't think they've got any outstanding players, frankly. Really, I don't, we can maybe argue with that. I can't think of one that's. I mean, Martin Boyle's having a great season, but he's in his mid-30s now, and he's kind of done well to reposition himself as a striker as opposed to a winger. That's been a good and successful move, but they haven't got really any outstanding talent. But it just goes to show if you organise yourself in terms of your spacing, your discipline as a team, everyone knowing their roles, the right people in the right roles. In this league, that simple fact goes a long way. So your credit due to David Gray for that. And in that sense, they were sticky opponents. They were difficult to break down. They were very resolute in their shape. They didn't leave gaps and holes for Celtic to exploit. And but they did play this very high line, and they did play this offside trap, and they eventually, of course, it failed them as it inevitably will do at this level. I think they caught Celtic offside something like 8 times during the game. But
paging Barcelona.
Yes, indeed. Well, yes. Play that high line when you're 3-2 up in the 95th minute of a Champions League semi-final. For Christ's sake, it's 3 against 4 at the back. Why did you do that? No, it wasn't quite that bad, but yeah. So I thought it was quite enjoyable. I thought the Celtic played pretty well. We can get into some of the individual performances later, and it was a good workout. I think all in all in the sun.
Yeah, like you say, David Gray letting players know their roles is a fantastic way to get started. I'm not sure Barry Ferguson has the same approach at Rangers because, like I said last week, if he doesn't know what they're doing, how they're supposed to be doing. Just a point of interest here. Rangers, I'm going off on a tangent. They have been connected. Their possible next manager is going to be Carlo Ancelotti's son. They have a knack of attracting the offspring of footballing greats. They've got Ancelotti, Hadji, Dean Windass. You know, it's like
Dean Windass.
Dean Windass.
In the same breath as Georgie Hadji, that's genius.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
So
it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy because if you think about every player they signed, so this is in the new. This especially been I've noticed it in the time span of the new club. Every player has to be the equivalent of a regen in Championship Manager. Oh, he's the new this, he's the new that, he's the new. Well, I mean, what did Morelos get compared to? What did Ryan Kent get compared to? Which one of them got compared to Zidane? Was it Kamara? I can't remember. But they all get compared to these. So basically, it's logical to think, well, we'll just sign players with the same names as great footballers or footballing greats, and it'll be fine.
I'm sure Vladimir Weiss was going to be the Slovakian Messi. I'm sure that was a thing. But anyway, enough about them. We could laugh at them all day. James, I'll come to you. As Alan said, we'll get into some of the individual performances and feel free to give your overall thoughts. But one I wanted to bring up to you in particular was the return of Austin Trusty to the lineup. Getting a bit of stick for potentially being at fault for that first goal that Martin Boyle scored on 25 minutes. What's your thoughts on that? Is he becoming a bit of a scapegoat, do you think, for some people?
Yeah, probably. I think the fact that he hasn't been a clear and obvious upgrade on Scales is probably, given his price tag, I think that's probably got, kind of an albatross around his neck, so to speak. So, I'm always, and Rogers talked about this after the game. I think it was after the game. Him playing on the right side, it's not ideal. He doesn't really profile great, period. And then you throw the poor guy on the right side. As Alan said, Hibs didn't really present the kind of high press intensity that would have concerned me with that center back pairing in some ways, meaning that opens up Pandora's box as far as us getting in behind, which could have been even more problematic for him. I thought they were okay with their risk reward and how they kind of set up, other than, they kept rolling the dice with that high line in perpetuity, which again, I'm a fan of doing those kind of things tactically, meaning that intra-match and then mixing it up a little bit maybe, but they just kept going at it. So I didn't think Trusty was that bad. Not ideal on the goal. It was kind of sloppy, but again, he hasn't played much recently and he's on the wrong side. So I have some empathy for him. But yeah, I thought it was a entertaining game. I thought Hibs were, as they have been for the majority of this run, they were set up coherently. Like I said, I didn't really like how they persisted with the high line. Alan commented in our chat room at huddlebreakdown.com that it was a matter of time, and it was before we finally, timed to run properly. But they were effective at creating the offsides. And then the other thing I thought they did well was that when they did drop back into their defensive third, and it's something I've commented pretty regularly in recent months, is they didn't fall into this trap of going man v man. They were very kind of man zonal hybrid, and we had a tough time breaking them down because they were well positioned, well structured, a lot of block shots. Like we were doing our normal kind of 20 plus yard shots from distance, and almost all of them were blocked because they were pretty disciplined in their shape and kind of packing the box. So it was that disconnect they had between getting from that high line into that where we really capitalized on them, got them in transition. Which again, with Kuhn kind of back in some form, and that generally being a relative strength to an Idah in his ability to get in behind, and Maeda being Maeda, it was just a matter of time. So very entertaining.
Absolutely, it was, as it always is when the sun is shining on Celtic Park. Alan, James brought it up a little bit there, and Adam Idah has been a topic of conversation ad nauseum on this podcast, as I'm sure he has on other podcasts, although I don't listen to them. I guess what I'm saying is Adam Idah needs to listen to us. If he would just face towards the goal, run forward, stay as close between the posts as he can, not only will he score goals, but he'll also create chances for other people, because those first two goals for Kuhn and for Idah himself on 41 and 45 minutes, that was essentially what happened. They were looking for the run of Idah, and that's what created the chances. Am I being far too simplistic about it? I fear you're about to say yes.
No, this is what you want. I mean, he's got a reasonable amount of pace. It was frustrating that they kept getting caught offside. It wasn't just him. Across the front line, that's three pretty quick players, really. So it makes sense to keep trying to trigger that trap. And Idah should be looking to spin in behind. I'd rather he did that. In fact, his angled run for his goal was terrific. Actually, it's great movement. So that was great to see. But he's still a mixed bag, and he almost plays like a 21-year-old, not a 24-year-old. I think that's the guy's got a reasonable amount of experience, both at Norwich City and even at international level. And I think that's my frustration, is that I think he should be less decision erratic than he is, and less stylistically erratic. In terms of 1 week he's holding the ball up really well, 1 week he's coming short all the time, 1 week he's only playing between the posts. It's like, I'm sure Rodgers isn't telling him to do different things. He just seems to take it upon his head as like, this week I'm going to do this, or this week I'm going to be like this kind of striker. So he needs to simplify, unclutter his game, and when he does, he can be very effective, as he was. It was a great finish. It was a great run. So we want to see more of that. I just want to come back to Trusty, right? So this has been a fascination to me. This is a player who, to my mind, has a significant number of people have just been down on him from the second he signed, and he seems to be just one of the boo boys, as does happen. And this goal that we conceded was yet another lightning rod for it. But I just don't see the goal in that way. It was one of those classic, three things go wrong and they score. But those three things were material to why the goal was scored. It wasn't one thing; it was three things. Yeah, what was that? Well, kind of four. But firstly, Taylor lets the ball go over his head, which is a positional error. He then fails to block the cross. The cross then finds its way to the lad at the end of the edge of the box, Campbell. Ralston is too slow for me in coming out to block the shot, and he doesn't block the shot. Trusty then blocks the shot. So what's he supposed to do? So the guy just had time to take a free shot at goal because Ralston's not closed him down, and he's blocked it. Now, where the ball goes is kind of random because he's literally had like less than a second to react. Now, you might argue, could his body shape have been better, and and it went straight to Boyle's feet? Well, that's kind of unlucky, yeah. And Boyle finished really well, to be fair to him. But that's four things that went wrong. I would say he's the least culpable in that situation because he actually did the job. He actually is the only one that did anything. The others failed to do their jobs. He did his job. He blocked the shot. Is it his fault that it fell directly to the feet of the striker? So I just and other than that, he was fine. He was kind of unspectacular and solid and all that. And he doesn't have the passing of skills. As I said to you, I agree with James. He isn't a massive upgrade on skills, but they're different players. He is a defensive upgrade on skills, but he's not a ball progression upgrade on skills. And ball progression's very important to Rodgers, and it's very important to Celtic's style of play. So it is disappointing to spend that much on somebody who isn't overall in the round an upgrade, but neither is he utterly unsuitable like Lagerbielke or just not of the right quality. He's perfectly serviceable. He's just not. We've got the same as we're always going to compare every midfielder to Matt O'Reilly. We're going to compare every centre back to Cameron Carter-Vickers, right? And we haven't got anyone that's reached his level, unfortunately. But I do find it slightly concerning the speed at which people jump onto Trusty, and I don't really know what it is or what it is that he's done, or is it just the price tag? I'm not sure, but it's certainly not warranted. Some of his performances in Europe were excellent. Him and Scales in Dortmund actually were very good. The defeat wasn't down to them. They were probably the best parts of that Celtic performance, and their performance together in Atalanta was very good. So, just wanted to kind of cover that bit.
No, I think that's a fair point. I'm just obsessed with you calling things stylistically erratic. That's a fantastic name for an EP or something like that. That'll be my debut EP, stylistically erratic.
Worst album I ever heard.
But James, I'll come back to you. It kind of carries on from the Idah conversation, but one of the things, and I will get Alan's thoughts on it because I know it's something that he's talked about before, but I wanted to see what you thought of this first. Daizen Maeda obviously has been forced out left for Idah to come in, and I know that Jota's injury has a lot to do with that as well. But I was looking through Maeda's attacking stats for the game. He only had 8 touches in the opposition box. He only had 1 pass into the final third and 1 successful dribble.
Sorry, that's a lot, Laura. 8 touches in the opposition box is a reasonable number.
It's 8 touches in the opposition box, right? I was thinking single figures. Yeah. I was thinking single figures is not good, but anyway.
It's decent.
It's decent, right? Okay, that's fine. But he had, obviously, 0 goals, 0 assists, no shots on goal, according to FotMob anyway. What's your opinion on the effectiveness of Maeda out wide left compared to that central role? Because as Alan has said previously, he's very much in favour of the central role that Daizen can play. I think I agree with that, and I'm just wondering if there's maybe a blind spot there for Brendan that he's so keen to make Idah work that he's willing to forgo what Daizen can do.
Yeah, I give Rodgers a little bit of credit. Kind of like last season when he was probably a little slow to come around to the Forest deployment. But he did eventually get to the point where when he had everyone available, that he did start Maeda through the middle as kind of the primary striker and got to that point. So I don't, he kind of did a little bit cooking and screaming, but he did it. And I think, I agreed with it. I thought Maeda kind of rewarded him with the quality of his performances once he did that. And he's kind of been forced into this now with Jota being out, unless he's going to, move to starting Forrest or Yang over Idah. And I think that, I'm going to be charitable. I probably wouldn't even do that. I mean, I think it's reasonable that he would make this move. Maeda, this is one of those things. I mean, it's kind of like the early season of Kuhn is that he was on such a run from like January up until about 2 weeks ago. It's unsustainable. Like, unless he's, Ronaldo or peak Messi or, you know what I mean? Like, guys that are going to post 50, 60 goal seasons. Like, you just can't keep that up. It's not sustainable. And we talked about that to a degree with which he was overperforming. He was scoring at an unsustainable rate relative to the chance quality. His finishing had kind of been, unsustainably good on a hot streak, and he'd had some help with some opposition keepers not doing all that well. So and the poor guy's been flogged this season. He's put a lot of minutes in, and he does not take time off. So, there's some wear and tear there. So I'm okay with him having a blasé stretch. I think he's earned it. I'm not all that concerned or critical of Rodgers' movement, of him back out wide, given his limitations on the squad. And, he's cooling off. I think that's just kind of a normal, to be expected aspect of how a season's finishing up.
Do you agree with that, Alan? I mean, I know you've talked about before that you like seeing Maeda through the middle and what he can offer that way. This is the problem with me quoting stats on this podcast, because I say things and then you guys go, well, actually, if you look at it in context, and I go, context is not my bag, guys, as everybody knows. I just say things. That's why I'm on a podcast. But anyway, Alan, what's your thoughts on the Maeda situation? Would you rather in the summer we look for somebody to replace him in wide so he can play through the middle more, or do you think this is going to be an ongoing issue until Jota's back?
Yeah, so I agree with James. If you looked at the available players, then Maeda, Idah, and Kuhn would be your front three. So pragmatically, I think that is the best way to go. I can't really argue with that. Just to cover your previous point, the player with the most average touches in the box per game this season is Kuhn with 6.53. So 8 is pretty high.
So 8 is very high, yeah.
Maeda's average is 5.33, so 8 is pretty high. So I do like that. I do like that piece of data, but it's like all of them, it's only in the context of usage with other pieces of data. If you're getting similarly, if you're getting in the box a lot, like he was, and not connecting with any crosses and not having any shots, you're sort of thinking, yeah, that's not very effective, is it? So it kind of can be a stick to beat players with if it's not going the other way. Just whilst you've been chatting as well, just another little factoid. And unfortunately, I don't break down. I suppose I could go on to maybe StatsBomb has this. I'm sure they do. Precise minutes at each position. Mine's a bit of a blunt instrument. I note the positions the player played during a game, but I don't denote. Oh, he played 15 minutes on the right, 15 minutes on the left, and 30 minutes down the middle. But games where Maeda has not spent any time as a striker, so for the duration of the game, he was on the left predominantly and sometimes on the right. He scored 15 goals in 33 matches. In games where he spent any time at all as a striker, he scored 18 goals in 16 matches. So that's a pretty blunt instrument, and you'd want to know what the XG was and blah, blah, blah. But I would say that in itself tells you a bit of a story, really. So that to me should be the long-term thinking with Maeda to your question. In terms of, why was he not particularly productive at the weekend? Well, apparently he's not going to be playing tomorrow, and he's not travelled with the squad. And that suggests he's carrying an injury, probably. He didn't look, to be honest, like his usual self at the weekend. So I'm just projecting now that maybe he wasn't 100% on the weekend, and that had something to do with his performance. I'm certainly willing to give him the benefit of the doubt in that sense. So it's been a long season for him. He's played a lot of games. There's only one game that really matters now. So I think if he's a bit injured and he's not feeling it a bit, yeah, I can kind of get that at a human level. So I wouldn't be too worried about that, I suppose, in the short term.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. He definitely wasn't looking his usual self, but I did burst out laughing at one point in the second half when he absolutely bust a gut to get back when Hibs were trying to counter-attack after a corner kick. And honestly, the only thing I could do was laugh, because I thought, what other player in the world is going to do that and do it as effectively as he did? So even though I think you're right, he's probably carrying something, and flights to and from Japan didn't probably help that either. He's still got an engine that's unbelievable.
We don't know if his wife has actually had this child or not. I've not read one way or the other. I don't know. I mean, I genuinely don't know. So if somebody knows one way or the other, it'd be great to hear.
All I do know is that he certainly came back to Scotland without the child having been born. That's the last thing I read.
Okay.
So
he's got that hanging over him, as well. Yeah. That's a huge thing, right? Yeah.
I'm presuming...
It was fascinating as well. Back to the incident that you mentioned during the game, it was fascinating. I mean, Kasper Schmeichel was just like, wow. He recognised the effort that had gone into that recovery, because it was late in the game, wasn't it?
Mm. It was unbelievable, and I think he got a wee dunt in the back for his troubles as well, which I don't think he appreciated. James, we'll move on from the game at the weekend, and I don't know why we're not all wearing party hats and got wee cakes out, because obviously it's 30 years since Dermot Desmond took over at Celtic. I guess before we go back to Alan and his thoughts on that, I wanted to get your thoughts on how significant a milestone that is, the effect that you think Dermot Desmond's had in the club, and the kind of ownership that he's presided over, because he's quite, I would say, an unusual sort of figurehead in comparison to other clubs of similar stature to Celtic. He's quite an eccentric guy, I would say, and certainly a Celtic supporter, I think. But there's division amongst the support in terms of what they think of him. So you're here to bring the peace and unite us all. Go for it. You're muted. That's a great start.
There we go. Always
Is
professional.
this some kind of silent protest against Dermot Desmond?
Yeah. No, what I was saying in silence was I'll start with the positives, because I think there are material important positives. I think that he continued, he exercised the power that he accumulated to continue the legacy of Fergus McCann in a prudence perspective, and in an industry filled with madness that I think deserves a lot of credit. I think that when they kind of got a little bit over their skis during the Martin O'Neill era, towards the end of that, they pulled back, and they did a share issuance, and they built Lennoxtown, which again, there's all kinds of talk about how that was done, that kind of thing. But I generally, directionally, I think those are all very positive. I think that he's been, when he has stuck his nose in on the managerial hiring front, he's generally been pretty good at that. He was seminal in bringing in O'Neill, I believe Strachan as well, and with Strachan being not everyone's cup of tea, you can't argue with kind of his portfolio of success with lesser resources, because we went through a little mini period, a cycle of austerity during the Strachan's tenure. And then he's kind of single-handedly been, the guy who's brought Rodgers in. And, Hal would have been okay. Like I wasn't like all crazy about Hal, but I think Hal would have been fine. And by all reports, that was Desmond's guy. So I those are all, I think, positives. I think the negatives are, I think we've reached a point where, particularly as the analytics revolution has progressed, and football has been kind of at the tail end of this across different sports, and the slowest to adopt and had the most resistance because of the kind of different level of intensity of the cultural importance of football for people in many respects. I think he's been a material problem in that sense. And I think, whether it was Stephen McGowan's article, I also listened to, Stephen was on Graham Spears' podcast that I subscribe to on Patreon, and Andrew Smith from Celtic Underground, obviously formerly a journalist. We're discussing all of this, and I think that this idea of an absent landlord, and I'm regurgitating what they've said, it's certainly been my understanding in talking with people, is that that's actually the exact opposite. If you have a criticism of Desmond, particularly in the last decade, it's that he's too involved. He doesn't want to get any of the headaches of involvement. He doesn't want to be dealing with, supporters yelling at him at games, and kind of the blowback of when things aren't going well. So but he's very much actively involved. And I've referenced in the past, Kieran Devlin, who was at The Athletic, he is, I think, still part of the Cynic podcast, had done reporting back in August of 2021 after Ange arrived, speaking with people Ange was friends with in Australia. And again, it's hearsay in the sense that, it's two people removed, but Devlin reported that, Ange had told his friends that he's shocked at how involved the owner was. And this was when we were signing James McCarthy. This is when Hart came in, right? So Desmond's got a very kind of Big Five league EPL centric worldview of football. He's still very kind of archaic. He's still kind of, Alex Ferguson era of, Roy Keane era, like the conceptualization of how football is. I think that's very much how he sees things. And I think because of that, we've been stuck in a past time and how we're operating. So even if he was really, really good at picking players and all this other stuff, he's a de facto kind of sleuth, pseudo director of football role that he's sometimes playing. And now he's like a meddlesome owner. And I've talked about this. Like, these guys are all over the place in North American sports. Jerry Jones with the Cowboys, David Tepper, who's worth $1 bazillion. It can run a hedge fund like no one's business, but he cannot run an NFL team for crap. Like the Carolina Panthers, he's completely, derailed that organization, and they've made awful decisions, mostly with him meddling. Right, so this is not unique. Mark Cuban in the NBA was an infamous meddler at the Dallas Mavericks. So these kind of billionaire, really smart people, very competitive. If they want to be directly involved, and as it sounds like he is and has been at a material level, that's less than ideal. And particularly as the era of specialization and analytics has taken over. So, I would say the first kind of 20 years, I would give him a lot of credit. And then I think the scatter plot is starting to tip. And I think he's become a material net negative because of this meddling and him being directly involved with, recruitment and managerial hires, and basically refraining the club from modernizing the structure in how to source talent. Basically, that's my big thing. So mixed, but going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think Celtic supporters can take a very oversimplistic view of a billionaire being in charge of your club, and why don't they just put their hands in their coffers and hand it out? Obviously, the running of a football club and the maintenance of a football club and the making it stay sustainable is a lot more complex than that. So I don't think it's necessarily his job to just throw money at the club, even though on a couple of occasions that's definitely what he has done. There's rumours that the Robbie Keane purchase at such a terrible time was essentially out of his pocket. I don't know how true that is, but it's certainly something that some people have alluded to. Alan, I've not had a chance to read the Stephen McGowan article. I know you have and have some thoughts on it. I have to say, though, it does make me a little bit uncomfortable when a journalist who has close ties to the club and is presumably looking to protect those close ties comes out in defence of the owner in the way that he has in recent days, because for me anyway, I don't know how much stock you can place on what he says then. Is that a harsh assessment of the situation?
Yeah, we could do a pod just on the failings of Scottish journalism and sports journalism in particular over the last 20 years. But one of my many observations about sports journalism in Scotland is that they behave like little regional journalists. So what I mean by that is, even here in Sheffield, we've got two teams outside of the English Premier League, and in the local newspaper, the Sheffield Star, there'll be pages on Wednesday, there'll be pages on United, there'll be journalists that dedicate their time to one or the other. Now, these people are not going to be able to do their jobs if they are always criticising and falling out with everybody. It would be impossible for them to do the jobs. You wouldn't expect that, but you would hope that there would be like at least a critical friend. But as we know in Scotland, that isn't the case. It's a much more sort of sycophantic, don't rock the boat type of attitude. I mean, I think certainly clubs the size of the Rangers and Celtic, and they're performing on a European level, you shouldn't have this small-minded regional journalist attitude. You should have these are big European level clubs. The owners are powerful people my job as a journalist is to hold power to account and not to be sycophantic. So that's just my piece on that one. The other thing is, especially in social media, but all things to do with most football discourse, we expect people to fall on a very sort of binary view on whether it's a player, as I mentioned earlier, with Trustee, or a manager, or performances, and even owners. And James is right. You have to take a balanced view, especially over 30 years. And there's much to commend about Celtic as we find ourselves today, and the reasons that he gave Ferguson McCann all that money to take effective control. Celtic are in the ridiculous and insane world of professional football, a very well-run football club by any measure. Right? I'm not saying they're brilliant, and James picks up on recruitment, and I'm not saying we're great at that either. But in the round, as a business, Celtic are a very, very well-run football club with very good commercial deals, with a very good balance sheet. Very low risk. Now, we can be low risk because of the dominance over other teams. We don't need to be taking risks like we did in the early part of the century, when, let's not forget, the disappointments that we all felt as supporters, the losses, the league titles on the last day, were all done against the backdrop of a club that was cheating. So, we didn't go down that road, and we are a very stable, financially well-run football club in that sense. My, if you want to sort of look at the other side of the balance sheet as regards Dermot Desmond, is come back to the general Patton quote about, if everyone in the room is thinking the same thing, then we've stopped thinking. And the way I would characterise Celtic as an organisation, as a board, and as a culture in terms of those that run the club, is that Desmond, because Celtic are small fry, even compared to Desmond's portfolio of companies that he owns, and he's an overpowering presence. And this is somebody, remember, who doesn't have any official executive role at the club, right? So it's a little bit undemocratic, actually, if we're being honest here, and it's a little bit dodgy as far as corporate governance, that he wields such individual control when he doesn't even have a formal job title. He's not the CEO. He's not the chief finance officer. He has none of those roles. So I find that unhealthy, and I find it not conducive to a sort of innovative, forward-thinking, challenging company where ideas and how can we get better and how can we improve ourselves, those things are welcome. It feels to me it's stale. The boardroom is stale. People are there too long, and and whilst there's the stability and the prudence and the sensibleness, we've gone too far in that direction. We don't have the innovation and the fresh ideas and the let people get on with it, and because ultimately he does seem to sign off on all the big calls. So that's my concern, and I think it manifests itself in performances in Europe. We have, I would say, Celtic have been unsuccessful in Europe relative to the size of the football club, to the economic power of the football club. We've actually been unsuccessful in Europe. As much as we've hoovered up domestic trophies, and James did a great piece a few years ago showing that actually we're pretty average in the domestic cups. Now that's changed since Brendan Rodgers came in with treble after treble, etc. But for a long time there, all these cups were for the taking. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful to every other club. Celtic's financial muscle is overwhelming in Scotland, and that's all the more reason. And again, it's a signal about corporate smugness and self-satisfaction. And McGowan's article, if I'm going to be very critical about it, never once mentioned Europe. He just talked about, but look at all the trophies. Oh, yeah, that's great. But given the overwhelming financial advantage, Celtic should be winning those trophies. That's not entitlement. It's just economics. And football is driven by economics, right? The benchmark for are we progressing as a football club and how good are we as a football club is in European performance. It's the only benchmark that matters. And on that side of the equation, I would say we have underperformed. We have underperformed. There's no doubt about that. So that he has to take ownership for that, because I think he's driven a culture where that has not become inevitable, but becomes so because people are smug, self-satisfied that Desmond's share price is being sustained. Desmond gets his little dividend. The bottom line looks good. We beat the Rangers, and the trophies have come in, and everyone's patting themselves on the back. That shouldn't be the hunger. The hunger should be, what did we do in Europe? Oh, we didn't get out of the group. Well, that's not good enough. How do we get better in Europe? What are we doing about that? Who do we need to bring in? What do we need to change? Where's that hunger? Where's that drive to make those improvements? Because they're the ones that matter. Where Celtic are today, the hegemony they have over Scottish football, it almost doesn't matter. It's unhealthy, actually. What matters is how they perform in Europe, and that's the standard he should be judged as an owner.
Absolutely, I think most Celtic supporters would agree with you there that Europe has to be the benchmark because all things remaining as they are, we're going to continue to dominate Scottish football, but even that is a very thin line to tread and could be upended at any point. Speaking of which, we've talked about Celtic's place in Scottish football. We've talked about the strength or lack thereof of the league as a whole. James, we've got Aberdeen tomorrow night. We could sit here and go over Aberdeen and what we can expect against them tomorrow night, but at this point in the season, we've done that a couple of times. What I think would be more interesting to discuss is the fact that at the beginning of the season with Aberdeen, we were all very excited at the fact that they seemed to be mounting a serious challenge, not necessarily to the league title, but to certainly splitting up Celtic and Rangers and providing a real challenge to the status quo within the league. That quickly fell away, as you guys predicted it would. Not to be too we told you so about it, but that is the case.
That's our brand, Laura. That's our brand. We want to tell people we told you so.
Yeah, we'll get the t-shirts up on the website. We told you so. But what's your thoughts on Aberdeen now, where they stand, Jimmy Tilleen, and just generally this kind of... Because I think as a Celtic supporter, I want to see more teams challenging. I want a strong Aberdeen, a strong Dundee United. I'm not really bothered about strong Hearts, to be fair, but the point stands. How do you feel about the start of their season and how it seems to have fizzled out the way it has?
Yeah, so there was this lull that took place. I mean, that while I thought they were overperforming and they were very unlikely to kind of persist. They were scoring a lot more goals than what the underlying metrics suggested that they would sustainably. Is that what was giving me some hope was that some of the in what I'll call the internals, average chance quality versus average chance quality conceded, those kind of things were actually pretty good, even though. So I thought they were going to, probably have some results swing against them just because of, some luck and variability. But they just kind of fell off a cliff then, starting in November and then December, where a lot of the internal stuff really dropped. And that persisted for, I don't know, maybe 2 months. And then they kind of bounced back again. I don't know if some of that was because of what they did in the January window. There has been some kind of rolling in of new players, particularly in defense, I think, with Tilleen as he's continued to overhaul the squad. So I think the lesson on Aberdeen over the last few years, because I was looking at this last week, and we're going to have our friend Gavin on to preview the cup final, because we're not going to preview tomorrow's game because I think both teams are going to be cagey, between rotation and tactics. Like, neither are going to want to give away really any kind of thinking as far as what they're going to do in the cup final. So I don't think there's a whole lot to preview in the game. But we're going to have Gavin on extra time next week to go through a proper preview. But my sense is that, the lesson is, if you go all the way back to Glass when he came in, and they've kind of chopped and changed managers and they chop and change players. If you look at the underlying performance data, the best season that they've had in the last few, like a non-penalty XG differential, was Glass's season. right? So what, in this alternative universe, if they were just stuck with that guy and continue to build off of how they were, I'm not saying that would have been the best idea. I'm just saying that this season, I think there's been a lot of kind of iffy things that have gone on. It hasn't been as good as I was expecting, as I said, but at least they're kind of directionally look like they have a coherent plan. And I think recruitment's kind of been, Keskinen I had never really got, and he hasn't really done anywhere near as much given the outlay as you might think. So I think, there's some questions still there, but I think they should stick with it. You know what I mean? Like, I think they need to persist with, because I think they at least have a coherent game model, and, they seem to be, building up play in a certain way. Like, I understand what Tillene is doing or trying to do, and it's consistent with what he did with Ellsberg. And I kind of get that model moving to Aberdeen and it making sense. So I just want to see him kind of stick with it, and not get derailed as they have with all the other managers preceding up until this point. So I'll be curious to see what they do this summer, and if they make it a little bit better strides in recruitment, and kind of refresh heading into next season. Because I do think what they've done in defense has helped in since the January window.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Stephen Glass there and the Aberdeen team that he had, because I distinctly remember I was at a Celtic Aberdeen match 28th November 2021, and they performed fantastically. We did end up winning 2-1, but here's some facts for you from that game. So Scott Brown started in the midfield for Aberdeen alongside Lewis Ferguson and Dylan McGeoch. And I was there to witness James McCarthy starting a league match for Celtic Football Club. Now, if that is not a collector's item, I don't know what is. I'm looking at it right now. And Albion Ayeti came off the bench. I mean, I can't even imagine there's going to be many people left in 50 years' time who can say they saw Albion Ayeti and James McCarthy on the pitch for Celtic, but I can say that's for certain. Alan, your thoughts on Aberdeen? I think a lot of what James said there is absolutely fair. Like, they were definitely showing the right intentions at the start of the season, and they were catching a lot of people off guard. Whether they've been figured out by people or whether their own sort of motivation to keep going with what the manager has said has fallen away, I'm not sure. But what's your thoughts on how far they can go under Tillene, or in general how far they can go in trying to re-establish themselves as a major force in Scottish football?
Well, it's all there, because as we've established and as David Gray has demonstrated at Hibernian, you don't need to make massive improvements. I mean, this is what we keep saying about, James keeps alluding to in terms of, the threat of a newly owned Hearts, the threat of a newly owned, Rangers side, is that you don't have to, in Scotland, the standard is so low, you don't have to improve a lot to make some quite significant gains. So in that sense, they're probably not a million miles away in theory. And I am one of the things I'm pretty open about changing my mind when the data changes. One of the things I'm pretty fixed on is that in general, football clubs don't give managers enough time. I just think that's a truism. There's always going to be exceptions, but I think that's generally true. And I'm looking at you, Barry. Not had enough time yet, mate. Stick in there. But anyway, back to Aberdeen. So listen, I wouldn't advocate any knee jerk in terms of, even when they were going through that awful spell, he was given support in the January window. He brought in a host of players, mainly sort of Scandinavian based or from that sort of network, and he's taken action. He's discarded the likes of Rubezic, who I just thought was a terrible player, really. He's reshaped the midfield. He's, I think Helt Nielsen. He's solved the problem that we called out quite early on, where Helt Nielsen and Shinnie as a central midfield pair were just going to get run all over. As clever and as smart players and as tenacious as they both are, they just don't have the legs to hold together a top-level team in central midfield. He's addressed that. Shinnie's at left back. I think Helton Nielsen's injured now, but Clarkson's now in a sort of deep-lying quarterback role, which I think is a sensible thing to do. Keskinen, don't see it. I don't want to be unfair to the lad. I just don't see it. And the Ockles that he brought in again, he said they've both had good runs now. I'm not seeing it. I don't want to write them off. Maybe they'll come good. I would stick with it though. My bottom line is I'd stick with it, but you need to be aware that that good run masked quite poor actually underlying performance. If you look at the expected points table, so this is what you should have won type league table of. If the points had been attributed based on expected goals performance, that they would be seventh. They'd be 6 points off bottom, and they'd be 40 odd points behind Celtic. That is where they are in terms of underlying performance. I don't think that's inaccurate, right? They wouldn't be in the top six. Okay. So they'd be a long way. They'd be 15 points behind Hibs. They'd be 13 points behind Hearts, who again, I wouldn't have got rid of Critchley on that basis, on the sense that the underlying data says they're the fourth best team in the country. So I would have stuck with that, but that ship has sailed now. So they're not in a great position, but they've undergone huge squad changes. They've given, Thelin the players that he wanted. And I think they should look to build from there. So, but the performances aren't good. Watch their game at the weekend. I couldn't work out what they were trying to do. The two wingers kept getting the ball and trying to beat their fullbacks for pace, and I don't think they did it once. It just wasn't very smart. I didn't, and I'm not sure about the lad Gay up front or Daba. I think Nisbet's probably the best striker that they've got, but he's on loan, I think, so I don't think he's even their player. So they've still got a lot to do. I don't want to dig up individual players necessarily, but they're just using those as indicators of I wasn't quite sure what was trying to be achieved and what the style was trying to get the best out of the forward areas. Really, I couldn't see it. I think the defensive players he's brought in are an improvement. But there's still a lot of work to do, but I would stick with it. I don't think more change and more upheaval than someone coming in and getting rid of all of Jimmy Tillin's players is going to be the way to go for them. They probably just need a bit of patience, a bit of time, and a bit of settling back to a settled 15 or 16 players, and they may improve. But they've got a bit of catching up to do with Hibs, I would say.
Yeah, really interesting the comparison between Hearts and Aberdeen there, and just brings to mind this saying that I always hear of perception is reality, and I think that can be the case sometimes, that you can perceive something to be real and therefore it is that way, but actually when you look at the underlying data it says something quite different. Alan, you might be above digging up individuals, as you say. I am not above that whatsoever.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put you on the spot because before we came online, I think you said you hadn't seen it. But James, I would be remiss if we didn't close out this show without talking about the absolute ridiculous display that Chris Boyd put on I think it was Sky Sports at the weekend, sitting next to Derek McInnes, essentially pitching for him for the Hearts job, while Derek just sat there kind of prim and proper and pretended like this hadn't all been pre-agreed in a production meeting. I mean, you were saying before that you saw it. I've never... What shocked me about it was when I saw the footage and what Boyd was saying, not only was it disrespectful to Kilmarnock, who Boyd is supposedly a Kilmarnock legend, but I actually thought McInnes must have been let go from Kilmarnock without me knowing, because I have never seen a manager who's currently employed lobby so hard and so publicly for another job. What did you make of it? I thought it was absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, this is this whole story with McInnes going to Hearts is I I think it's tailor-made to drive me insane. Because I get the
Union Saint-Gilloise, no more.
well, that's right. So I get from a style of play perspective, and so I understand how like a modeling could come up with McInnes if the criteria that was given to the model is he has to be a Scottish manager. He has to know the league, which based off of some of the reporting from like Heart Standard that I read, that seems to be the case. Like for whatever reason, they came away from.
Yeah, but can he get from the Royal Mile to the Grass Market? Can he do that?
Who knows? I mean, that would be important. But so this led me to go back to a Sloan analytics conference panel that I've referenced before. It's from 2022, and a comment by a guy named Luke Bourne, who is he's been part of this Redbird Capital group that bought AC Milan and they bought Toulouse, and he's part of this analytics company called Zealous, which is like an AI machine learning modeling company that does analytics across sports. So he's worked at Sacramento, he worked at Roma, Sacramento Kings in the NBA. So pretty smart guy, PhD, and I think astrophysics or something. That's not something fancy, STEM. So they were talking about finding talent to employ in analytics at football clubs and soccer in this conversation. And this is Luke Bourne. I quote, "I would find the people that have really solid technical skills from other sports and haven't spent a lot of time being corrupted by the overwhelming irrationality that exists in football." Okay.
You talk about Chris Boyd here.
That a lot.
Right. So the reason why I referenced this is because the fascinating aspect of the football world is overwhelmingly irrational, and Scotland within that world is probably on the crazy town end of irrational. So you have this Tony Bloom. This is why I've been so focused on this. You have Tony Bloom, who's definitely in this other world, trying to come in to Hearts. And one of the first things the Hearts do is say, "Oh, we got to have a manager that knows the league."
Yeah, and we'll offer Lauren Shankland $15,000 a week, apparently,
and Gordon apparently an extension, right? So it's like you're being served up this gift in access to a world-class like intellectual property framework to manage a club, and the first few things that they're doing is like insane. So it doesn't mean it's not going to work, by the way. It's just that it's these world colliding is what's so fascinating. And what I find really interesting with the McInnes hire, because again, I get it from a purely analytics perspective, but I don't see how he's going to operate and like listen to the analytics people and say, well, you should like make this adjustment with your tactics. Maybe. I mean, like, I don't know. Like he just based off of what you're talking about, like the segment with Boyd, he doesn't strike me as the most humble person.
Just my brogues.
Right. So he's very specifically been anti any kind of director football model because he's wanted full control at the clubs that he's been at. Now, I will say, I'll circle back with this. A lesser known story that's been unfolding is kind of discount Tony Bloom people have taken over Dunfermline. And they have a gambling background. These two guys that are...
Oh, is Neil out? Is Neil out?
Well, no, they're negotiating. They've been negotiating with Neil Lennon to come in. And, he did come in on a temporary basis to close out the season. So, Lennon wouldn't be my first pick as far as someone who's going to be progressive and like buy in. But the public comments that Lennon's made about meeting with the ownership group have been pretty, complimentary from Lennon's perspective, meaning that he sounds like he might be a convert. Which welcome, Neil. It's
basically
5 years too late, but anyway, better late than never.
Basically, he went to them and said, "Can I have Victor Wanyama?" And they said yes.
Well, at Dunfermline in the Scottish Championship, maybe that makes sense. I don't know, but my point is maybe McInnes has found Jesus. I don't know. Like maybe he's a convert. Maybe he's recognizing his selfish interests if he buys in. I'm just skeptical until I see it, based off of how he has conducted himself and his career up until this point. But it's going to be fascinating. It really is coming up this whole summer transition, going into next season. Like, there are so many fascinating storylines. To me, it's the most interesting across. Celtic might actually be one of the more boring stories, other than the squad overturn. Unless there's something goes on with Rodgers' contract situation. But there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the league. And McInnes at Hearts with Jamestown and Bloom is probably the most fascinating.
Oh, I love Scottish football in all its facets. After we record this, I'm going off to watch the playoff between Partick Thistle and Livingston, because that is going to be a tasty encounter. Alan, to close out the show, we'll get your thoughts on the whole McInnes to Hearts move. James's answer provided a lot less Chris Boyd bashing than I would have liked, but
isn't that just known?
Yeah. Anyway,
it's a waste of breath. I mean, you just let people watch him. There's nothing more I can add. I mean, it's self-parody. I can't add anything. He damns himself from his own mouth. It's a bit of a surprise to me, and the timing of it as well, because I don't believe that. And listen, I know in reality, right, that they've got the formal approvals to go through. I don't think the Bloom investment proposal has even been formally rubber stamped by the Foundation of Hearts. Those box ticking things have not been done, but there's no way under the covers that people aren't just kind of getting on with it. I'm sure that's the case. And I'm sure this has full support of Jamestown Analytics. And, listen, we kind of, there's a danger that we sometimes characterize that because it's analytics and because it's a big database, because it's smart people and it's astrophysicists and what have you, that therefore every appointment has to be, as James characterized earlier, this Irish South African geophysicist MBA analyst that's never watched a game of football in his life, but he's a genius and we must have him because nobody's heard of him. In fact, if anyone's heard of him, we're not having him. It's not like that. It's about making smart choices. They believe that Neil Critchley, for example, who's an experienced football manager, would be maybe a good cultural fit or what have you for the way that the Hearts wanted to be. Now, they've felt that that's not worked out. I disagree respectfully, and probably not from a position of great authority. Disagree slightly. I think they're kind of on the right lines. I think they need to look at one or two of their senior professionals and then start from there. And I think the rest of it would probably have kind of improved a little bit. But anyway, it's done now. So it doesn't have to be immediately moved to sort of, beardy street, tree stroking PhD genius, never seen a game of football in their life. It may be that they feel that Derek McInnes is actually a wise choice at this point in the club's transition to a different model.
Can I just jump in there, Alan?
Yeah,
the word stroking and PhD were far too close together there, but anyway, carry on.
Yes, I think I've made my point. So I'm not saying this isn't, as James said, I'm not saying this is not going to work out. It's slightly surprising. I think if they're offering contracts to Shankland and Gordon, that to me is lunacy. I think the team would improve immediately if they found replacements at that price point. If they managed to get people in with the ability that matched their wages, I think they'd be doing. They could with the Star Lizard database. I think they'd probably find some talented footballers. So that side of it, if that is true, that's not confirmed. It does seem that McInnes thing is happening. Yeah, it's a surprise, but listen, as I say, they may be taking a long view. And again, I keep coming back to, on the one hand, yes, small improvements to your football club can see you rise up the SPFL quite quickly in the lower reaches because of the inefficiencies and the madness therein. If you're going to go down all in on a analytics-driven recruitment, sports science, cultural shift for everybody, from boardroom to supporters route, it doesn't happen overnight. There will be bumps in the road. There will be some pragmatic decisions have to be made to bridge you to get to certain points, right? And that's true of all football clubs, by the way, not just Hearts. All Scottish football clubs that may be going down this route. So those two things I think can coexist. I think you can see improvements because I'm not saying that Hibs Hibs, as we saw on Saturday, are clearly not going to be disruptors to Celtic in terms of the Championship. They're just not, right? They're a good side who've been improved by a very competent, well-organised coach who's got a clear idea, communicates his ideas clearly. The players have bought in and they're executing on it. Brilliant, well done. But that's not going to make them Europa League group stage disruptors. That's not going to make them challengers to Celtic at the top level. That's what Hearts want to do. That's what Tony Bloom wants to do, right? So that requires patience. That level of change requires patience, and it requires cultural change, and it requires people to stick with it. And there will be oscillations along the way in terms of form and fortune.
There absolutely will be. There will be lots of oscillations in form and fortune, not only in Scottish football, but on this podcast. We all have our good days and our bad days. I think the three of us had good days today. You guys will be back, as you said earlier, later in the week with the Extra Time show, and then next week with the Extra Time show with our Aberdeen supporting friend Gavin, who will break it down for us for the final. But until next week, everybody enjoy the football that's on offer. James, Alan, it's been a pleasure, and we will see you all again next week.